Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Plan Changes to FY 2023 DNA Capacity Enhancement for Backlog Reduction Program, hosted by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Borchardt, Senior Forensics Policy Advisor with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, for some welcoming remarks and to begin the presentation. Andrea?
Thank you, Daryl. And before we get started, I just want to go over the Department of Justice disclaimer that states any opinions or points of view expressed or those of the author, myself, do not necessarily reflect the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Next slide, please. My name is Andrea Borchardt, and I'm the Senior Forensics Policy Advisor overseeing the DNA Capacity Enhancement for Backlog Reduction, or DNA CBER program. Today, I'm planning to provide you the first of many webinars outlining the plan changes to the DNA CBER program. Next slide. So keeping in mind that today is just an overview of the first of the webinars, today's agenda includes a brief history of DNA CBER, the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program, the plan changes for FY 2023, so next year, obviously not the one that you guys just submitted, and what's happening next. We'll finally conclude with a Q&A. Support for testing was originally authorized through the DNA Analysis Backlog Elimination Act of 2000 and was reauthorized through the years as the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program. Generally speaking, the funds are for public accredited crime labs with access to FBI's CODIS, and the funds are administered via a formula. You can see with the chart on the side the range of total funding and number of awards for the past 10 years in this DNA CBER program. Through the DNA CBER program, funds can be used to support the following purposes. One, to carry out for inclusion in CODIS, DNA analysis of database samples collected under applicable legal authority. Two, to carry out for inclusion in CODIS, DNA analysis of forensic case or crime scene samples. And three, to increase the capacity of publicly funded forensic DNA and DNA database laboratories to process these samples for CODIS. Of note, the graphic on the side outlines some of the successes of the program, including supporting testing of over 1.3 million forensic cases, as well as over 500,000 profiles uploaded to CODIS, crime scene samples uploaded to CODIS. Indeed, the program funds have been involved in nearly 1/2 of all CODIS hits missed by the FBI, or the FBI's CODIS. Next slide. 34 U.S.C. 40701, the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program. This is where Congress authorized the use of funds for what is now known as the DNA CBER program, and what the program is now being aligned with. So as you can see here, the authorization of grants. The Attorney General may make grants to eligible states or units of local government for use by the state or unit of local government for the following purposes. One, to carry out for inclusion in CODIS, DNA analyses of samples collected under applicable legal authority, so database samples. Two, to carry out for inclusion in CODIS, DNA analysis of samples from crime scenes, prioritizing, to the extent practicable, consistent with public safety considerations, samples from rape kits, samples from other sexual assault evidence, and samples taken in cases without an identified suspect. And three, to increase the capacity of laboratories owned by the states or units of local government to carry out DNA analyses of samples specified in the two previous paragraphs. So you can see really where we got the purposes of CBER when you look at the authorizing legislation here. Next slide. So what does this all mean for you? Well, the first will be a couple changes in eligibility, which I will go over in the next couple of slides. There will also be an alignment in how funds in the program can be used. Again, I'll go over that in the next couple of slides as well. We're also making efforts to streamline the application as well and to provide training for applicants so they can better understand the application and award-making process. We're streamlining the eligibility process or the eligibility certification. Instead of writing out your eligibility statement that you have in the past years, we'll include all the requirements in the certification form that will need to be signed by the Chief Executive Officer of the state or unit of local government. And finally, the secondary allocation for the test law legislation for sexual assault kit testing that we've offered the past couple years, we'll offer that in a competitive manner to help interested applicants, quote, maximize the effective utilization of DNA technology to solve crimes and protect public safety. In this last topic, we'll discuss this more in later webinars. Today we'll focus on really on the eligibility and streamlining efforts. Next slide. So an outline of the major eligibility changes are as follows. So on that form that I said we will provide to you that you'll have signed by your chief executive officer of the state or unit of local government. You'll have to estimate how much of your award, with a minimum of 40% of the award, that will be used to carry out DNA analyses of samples from crime scenes for inclusion in CODIS. Second, you must estimate the portion of funding. There is no minimum required for this, but you must estimate the portion of funding that shall be used to carry out DNA analyses of samples collected under applicable legal authority, such as convicted offender or arrestee samples, and for inclusion in CODIS. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you go back there? I'll have one more bullet point on there. And similarly, you must estimate the portion of funding, no minimum required, that shall be used to increase the capacity of the laboratory to carry out DNA analyses of database and crime scene samples for inclusion in CODIS. Now the next slide. Two other changes for the eligibility. On that certification form, again, that gets signed by the Chief Executive Officer of the state or unit of local government, you must provide assurances that the state or unit of local government has implemented or will implement, no later than 120 days after the date of such application to the program, a comprehensive plan for the expeditious DNA analyses of samples in accordance with the purposes of this solicitation. Note, you do not need to send us your plan. Instead, you must have the eligibility certification form signed, indicating that you do meet this requirement. It is up to each laboratory to determine what might meet this requirement for your agency. While BJA cannot suggest one method over another, things that have been brought up to me by other laboratories when I've discussed this include efforts made to improve efficiency, such as a Lean Six Sigma style evaluation, batching samples, shift work, implementation of automation, and robotics. Again, it's up to each laboratory to determine what would qualify as their comprehensive plan for the expeditious DNA analyses of samples in accordance with the purposes of the DNA SABRE program. Finally, for the last eligibility change, you'll need to provide assurances that the DNA section of the laboratory to be used to conduct DNA analyses has a written policy that prioritizes the analysis of, to the extent practicable and consistent with public safety considerations, samples from homicides and sexual assaults. And I know that most labs do likely follow this with some sort of policy, either formal or informal, but now you must provide us with assurances that you do in fact have a written policy that prioritizes the analysis of, to the extent practicable and consistent with public safety considerations, samples from homicides and sexual assaults. Okay, I know that's a lot to absorb, and again, we will be posting this, we'll be recording this and posting this, and I will provide more webinars to go over this training. The next thing I want to go over is the alignment and uses of funds and give some examples. So when I said the program would formally align the uses of the funds with the purposes of this program, what will likely help you is to always remember that the uses of your funding must be tied back to the processing of samples for CODIS and increasing the capacity of the laboratory to process samples for CODIS. And remember, while some of the types of tests may be incredibly valuable, they just might not be eligible under this specific program. It does not mean you could not seek other sources of federal funding to achieve some of those goals. So let's run through some of the examples here. So Kinship. This is a little bit tricky because some uses of Kinship would be okay, so long as they're supporting CODIS eligible samples, such as human remains testing. And while incredibly valuable to assist with certain cases, Kinship for non-CODIS samples would not be acceptable. If you're not sure, please just reach out to me and ask. Again, we have 9 or 10 months to go over this before the changes occur in FY23. Similarly, YSTRs and MITO. This is also tricky, as is Kinship. But if you're using these technologies for CODIS eligible purposes, then yes, it would be totally acceptable. And again, while incredibly valuable to assist with certain cases, using YSTRs and MITO in ways that are not for CODIS would not be acceptable under this program. Again, if you're not sure, because there can be some gray area and it would be case-by-case basis potentially for certain agencies, please ask. My contact information will be at the end of this webinar. Next, for genetic genealogy. Since testing for genetic genealogy is not currently CODIS eligible, there are no permitted uses under this program. Okay, accreditation. Again, yes, expenses relating to maintaining the scope of accreditation for NDIS approved technologies is acceptable. But expanding a scope for a non-NDIS approved technology would not be acceptable. Again, think about everything that has to align with this program has to be related to processing samples for CODIS, and increasing the capacity to process samples for CODIS. So things like bringing in a team for an annual audit would be totally acceptable. All right, conferences and trainings. Yeah, most of this would still be completely acceptable, but remember, it really needs to relate to the processing of samples for CODIS or increasing the lab's capacity to process samples for CODIS. So things like a staff retention or master's degree or PhD, funding any of those would not be permitted under the program, but attending a training to learn how to operate a new instrument or new robot would be acceptable, as would training to support QAS continuing education requirements. Validation. Again, yes, most validations would be acceptable. Again, so long as they're related to processing samples for CODIS or increasing the capacity to process samples for CODIS. Again, if you're unsure about any of these, my contact information will be posted at the end of the slide deck, and I'm happy to talk with you about your specific questions if it relates just specifically to your agency. And we have many, many months to go over this to make sure you have a clear understanding of what's happening in FY23. All right, next slide, please. Okay, streamlining. We'll be making efforts to streamline the application narrative. This does not mean we're streamlining the whole application process, because many of the components that are included in the application, such as the SF424, the SFLLL, NEPA, et cetera, are mandatory for these for all relevant programs, such as CBIRD. However, the application narrative and the eligibility statement will be streamlined in FY 2023. Next slide. What's coming next? Well, first, I made an announcement about the changes at the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods in July. And today is the first public webinar outlining the plan changes for the FY23 CBIRD solicitation. We've also launched an FAQ document on our CBIRD microsite. The link is there. Also, if you have not accessed that microsite yet, it does have information about the program. BJA staff will also be speaking at FBS CODIS conference later this year in November, as well as host 2 more webinars to properly communicate these changes to the field. What I do ask of all of you is to please ensure that all points of contact are updated in Just Grants for your CBIRD awards to ensure you're on the distribution list for future notifications about the program. We'll also post content to that BJA microsite. Note that these plan changes will take place in FY23 CBIRD solicitation pursuant to congressional appropriations and will not impact awards that have already been made. And with that closes the informational portion of the webinar, and we'll open up the floor to questions. Remember, I know this is a lot of content to digest, but this is just the first of many webinars on the topic, so you have time to absorb the information and figure out if you have questions in the future. You're welcome to reach out to me directly, contact information here, if you have specific questions that may only impact your entity. Again, my contact information is on this slide, and many of you already know that I'm more than happy to talk with you about the program and about your specific awards. Daryl?
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. So just a couple housekeeping items. I did enter the link in the chat that you can access and link directly to that FAQ document that Andrea mentioned on the previous slide for your reference. And also, there was a question about how to get a copy of the presentation. Once everything is concluded and we get things finalized in 508, you'll be sent an email to the email you registered with today on where those will reside on the BJA website. So know that that'll be coming within about 7 to 10 business days or so. So if you do need to go back and reference this PowerPoint or presentation, you can do so then. So if you do have a question, far bottom right, there's 3 dots. Click that, hit Q&A, and then enter, send all panelists. And do have plenty of time today to get through those as we need to. So the first one, Andrea, is for CBIRD, who's considered to be the appropriate chief executive officer of a local government?
It's a very good question. Thank you, Morgan, for asking that. That will actually depend on the unit of local government itself. Oftentimes, like a county, and will depend on your specific agency, but oftentimes a county will have somebody in the title of Chief Executive Officer. You can usually find that through your county's website, or it might be an elected official. If you're in a city, it could potentially be, the mayor. In a state, it would likely be the governor. So it would really depend on which area you're serving or your agency serves and the specifics about your entity.
There was mention of the secondary allocation being competitive in nature, but it wasn't elaborated in today's presentation. Will that be forthcoming, or do you have information to provide on that?
Yeah, so I did mention that we'll go into that a little bit more on a subsequent webinar, but it seems like most people are interested in that. It would, again, be a very small portion held back from the main appropriation. So right now we hold back, this year there was about $100 million available for funding under the program, and $10 million was held back for the sexual assault kit test-all legislation funding. The plan right now, and it's definitely, the amount is TBD, but if it were appropriate in that same range, the idea is to hold back a similar amount, about the $10 million, to make sure that can be awarded competitively to interested applicants that could meet the requirements. Again, we'll go over more specifics in a later webinar, but that, I see the next question about how could this potentially impact formulary funds. That remainder of the appropriation for this year was $90 million, would then be distributed similarly as a formula to everybody else. So it should not impact a large impact on most of the applicants under the formula.
Great, thanks for that.
It looks like there's one more question kind of around that secondary allocation. So in essence, again, I will have a webinar that will specifically outline that. But the idea is a very small portion of the appropriation would be held back to be awarded competitively to any interested applicant to meet the requirements outlined there. And I think, let me go back to which slide it is, Daryl, I think that might help. Well, it looks like it's slide 8, if that helps. So this secondary allocation, it would not be a secondary allocation, it would be a whole separate purpose area where applicants can apply and get awarded competitively, where they can maximize the effective utilization of DNA technology to solve crimes and protect public safety. The remainder of the appropriation or funds available for the program would be something around $90 million, would then be applied to the states in a similar manner as it has been now, to in a formula for the states.
Okay. And to be clear, the competitive would only apply to currently eligible applicants, not NDIS eligible labs. Is that correct?
That is correct, Matthew. That question is good. So it would be only to current eligible applicants. It would not, the eligibility for that secondary portion, that competitive portion, would be the same applicant pool that's currently eligible for CBER. So it would be, again, following what is outlined in the Debbie Smith legislation.
Sorry if you've gone into this, Andrew. Is there any reasoning or background on why this particular change is being made?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is that this program was authorized by Congress, and the authorizing legislation, the Debbie Smith Backlog Elimination Act, or DNA Backlog Grant Program, does authorize what the program states. So in order to be compliant with what Congress is asking us to do with that legislation, we wanted to make sure the funding supports exactly what they outlined in that legislation. So the legislation has been around, and it's just because of the questions we've had, and it's because of the possibility that we would have other changes down the line, would not have enough time to communicate those to you. We want to make sure we're kind of getting ahead of that to make sure we're following exactly what Congress asked us to do with the authorizing legislation.
Can the minimum 40% be overtime funds to work cases for CODIS entry and reviews? Is there a limitation on how that's spent?
So that minimum 40% would have to be for DNA analyses related to processing crime scene samples for CODIS entry. So if that overtime was for if that 40% was for overtime funds to work crime scene cases for CODIS entry and reviews of that, then yes, that would meet that requirement.
Are there any changes proposed or being considered for the $250,000 recommendation for the minimum amount for a laboratory?
Yes, there are considerations for that. Within the legislation, there is actually a minimum requirement per state. So that minimum recommendation for a local laboratory is being considered to be changed. That has not been fully determined. So if you have feedback for us on that, I definitely welcome you to reach out.
This next one coming in is in Coverdale. If you apply for competitive funds, it actually decreases the formulary amount. That has not been the case with the additional amount for Testall and the Siebert grant. Do you anticipate that continuing to be the case for Siebert? So essentially labs would not be punished in the formulary if they choose to apply for these competitive funds?
That is a fantastic question. And I will want to confirm with General Counsel, but the way that I understand it right now, and I can clarify that in a future webinar, is that no, you would not be, I don't want to use the word punished, no, your state funding would not decrease if you applied for that secondary competitive portion of funds. So it would be two separate awards.
Do you need a plan and policy for case prioritization or just a policy? Can submission guidelines suffice?
You need a written policy. That's very clear in the legislation. So a written policy would be required for the prioritization.
Are changes to the performance measures expected?
As of right now, there's no expected changes to the performance measures for what I'll call the base funds. However, because there would be a potentially new purpose area / program for that competitive aspect, there would be different performance measures outlining that because we would need to change how we are measuring the success of that program.
Do service contracts for instruments used in DNA analysis qualify for the 40%?
I'm sorry, Dale, can you state that again?
Do service contracts for instruments used in DNA analysis qualify for that 40%?
That will be one I'll have to check with the General Counsel's office, and I think it would really depend on how you're using those instruments. So are they used for anything else? Are they only used for casework processing, et cetera? But that's one I will definitely make sure I clarify in future webinars.
That's all the questions in the queue at this time. If you do have one, please go ahead and enter that in the Q&A box. We'd be glad to get to it today. Go ahead and leave this what's next slide up as we go through the rest of today as well with that link. In fiscal year 22, Siebert, there's a requirement for a 2-day forensic grant workshop. Will this information be covered in detail in that workshop? Do you have a tentative date for that workshop? Or when it is?
Yes, we can talk about this information in that workshop. However, the workshop will likely happen after the FY23 Siebert solicitation post. So the workshop will be hosted through our new forensics training and technical assistance partner, which we competed that solicitation this year. So once they're awarded, that will be one of their first topics to bring on. And my best guess is that will be in the fall to winter of 2023.
Do you anticipate the cap for staff training remaining the same as the 22 solicitation?
Yes.
May funds be used for forensic paternity testing for sexual assault cases?
If the paternity samples would go into CODIS, so if it would be a CODIS type testing, then that could be Siebert funded. But otherwise, again, that's a type of testing that's incredibly valuable to a case. However, if it's not going into CODIS, then it would not be authorized under the program.
And you've anticipated post date for FY23, is it around the same time, again, next year, June-ish?
Oh, that would be fantastic if we could tell that far in advance, but it depends on so many factors, such as if and when the appropriation is made by Congress, some other budget requirements we have to go through to get things posted and reviewed. So we always are hoping that it's posted sooner, but if you're not already on the alerts on the BJA website, there's a funding alert anytime we post a solicitation that you can get alerted to the posting of it. So our hopes, it's is that it will be launched earlier than May/June, but it all is TBD until we actually get around to that time of the year.
Then this person wanted to understand correctly that you cannot get funding for MEDO testing or YSTR unless your legislation allows for such CODIS entry.
So not specifically about the legislation. So I won't be able to answer necessarily each state by state or local by local, but if you're not putting WISE or MIDO into CODIS for your state or local jurisdiction, then you correct that you could not fund WISE or MIDO. So if you had, say, a hair in a case and you wanted to do MIDO, and it was not going to go to CODIS, again, that could be incredibly valuable to your case. It just would not be appropriate for testing under this specific program.
Staffing remains an allowable use of funds for this program.
I'm sorry, did you say staff trainings?
Well, it just says, will staffing remain? Keep on staff.
Personnel expenses would still be authorized under this program. Again, you just have to remember about the minimum 40% required to go towards the analyses of crime scene samples for CODIS. So as long as that's what the personnel are doing with their time, then that would count towards that 40%.
If some samples analyzed only qualify for entry into DIS, is that still considered CODIS eligible?
Yes.
If we put YSTR profiles into local database, then we can continue to purchase Y amplification kits with grant funds. Is that acceptable?
Yes, so long as that the Y amplification kits are used for the purpose of getting things into the local database. You can purchase the kits and do, like one sample for the local database and then do everything else for non-CODIS eligible type samples. So you'd have to make sure you're very clear on how you're using it and documenting that clearly.
If you're processing a homicide and some samples are CODIS eligible, some are not, do you have to use funding from a separate source to cover the non-CODIS eligible samples?
I think you're getting a little too far into the weeds there. It would, again, depend, but again, the case is CODIS eligible, so you're working the case, so that would be okay. But, you don't want to get cute with the legislation. So, if you're trying to use that to justify being able to test 10 samples when you only have one that's really going to go to CODIS, that's going to be where we run into issues. So, use your best judgment on that. And if you're not clear on the specific case, please reach out to me.
Regarding kinship, if the sample is compared to a direct reference, say a toothbrush, the UHR is not entered in NDIS, can one assume this is no longer permissible in CBR 23?
So when we're getting into case-by-case specifics, so I'm seeing a couple scenarios and a couple asking specific questions, please put those to me. Actually, Daryl, if you can go to the last slide with my contact. We'll go over case specifics with you individually, not do that on a webinar.
Are the performance reports to be in PMT for FY23 as well?
So far, that is the plan. Yes, we are working to update Just Grants to potentially get PMT, basically end PMT and have everything in Just Grants, but the functionality in Just Grants is not there yet to support the type of information we gather through the PMT.
How is analysis defined for the solicitation? The main question is if analysis includes report writing and review personnel for those purposes.
If it's not currently defined in FY22, I know I put in a new definition section this year, and if I didn't specifically define it, I will make sure it's in for FY23. But yes, that would include report writing and review. So if you are processing a crime scene case, let's say it's an no suspect homicide, you're processing your samples for your no suspect homicide, that would include the examination, the laboratory work, including the capillary electrophoresis, the analysis, interpretation, report writing, review, and the CODIS entry. That would all be allowable.
For comprehensive plan for expeditious analysis, does this also have to be a written plan?
The legislation does not define that it needs to be a written plan. That is up for you to determine whether or not you feel like that's important. I do think that because this is a, you could have a desk audit that needs to describe what your plan is, that you're meeting the eligibility requirements. It might help you in the future, but that is not defined in the legislation that it must be a written plan.
This has been answered several ways, but just another angle of it. Would salary support for lab technicians fall under the 40% minimum?
It would depend on what the laboratory technicians are doing, if they're supporting database operations or casebook operations. And again, it would be similar to those service contracts for equipment, like if you're doing the CE service contracts, and it would depend on what they're supporting, but I can make sure I have that more clarified for you guys in the next webinar. And Daryl, I'm going to take that last question. I know it's a little bit of a specific question from Elaine. It says, for a homicide with a suspect, the crime scene sample, source ID known, will still be entered into CODIS to solve other cases. Is this acceptable? Yes, that is acceptable. Again, it's a CODIS, it's a DNA analysis of the case for CODIS entry. So yes, that would be completely acceptable.
Andrew, there was that one scenario based on, those are kind of being saved for personal outreach to you. I don't know if you wanted to get into that one.
Yeah, that one, I'm going to need more information about a sexual assault kit and grant-funded analyst and why. So if that's you who asked a question and haven't answered and it's scenario-based, definitely please send me an email, give me a call after the webinar. I'm definitely here to help you. I don't want to make this hard, which is why I'm trying to give you guys enough time to go over this and think about all your questions. Hit me up with all the questions you have. I'm going to have multiple webinars. I'll be speaking at FBI's CODIS conference. I want to make sure everybody has time to evaluate what their plans are, know what they're doing in FY23, move their budgets around as they need to, so that you will not have a disruption in service.
And generally, do you know when the next webinar can be held, at least by the fall?
So likely we're targeting February because FBI's CODIS conference is in November. So the next public speaking or semi-public speaking engagement will be at FBI's CODIS conference. But again, all of the CODIS participating laboratories who are the eligible applicants for this program should be in attendance. So I'll be there. It will be very difficult likely to do a Q&A there. But I will be speaking about this again to reiterate the information and hopefully provide updates on some of the questions I got here. But the next webinar like this will likely occur in February. So if you need questions answered before that, please, please, please email me, call me, anything you need to do to get a hold of me. I'm happy to help.
Other questions come in. Can you provide an example of what might be included in the plan for expeditious processing of samples?
I cannot, because I can't be at DOJ, we can't be the kind of gatekeeper of what would work for your agency or what you would define as expeditious processing of DNA samples for CODIS entry. That would be something up to you. But I did bring this up when I've talked to, I kind of did a listening session with a couple entities prior to going down this hole of changing, or this rabbit hole of aligning the program with the authorizing legislation. And a couple of things that those people brought up to me included efficiency evaluations like Lean Six Sigma, the instrumentation or robotics, the application and validation implementation of robotics in the laboratory to free up some of the analysts to spend more time on the bottlenecks like tech reviews, process mapping. Somebody said that they were considering batching. So that's actually up to you to decide. And again, you don't send me your plan. I will not be approving your plan. That is for your agency to assure us that you have implemented or will implement that plan within 120 days of the application.
Seems to be the end of the questions at this time. So I have a few more moments. If you do have anything, please go ahead and enter that in. Can nonviolent cases be processed with the minimum 40% as long as the priority is given to the violent crimes?
Yeah, that section doesn't have any specification of violence or nonviolence. It's about the CODIS eligible crime scene samples. So you need to spend 40% of your funds. You need to assure us that you're using 40% of the funds, a minimum of that, to process crime scene samples for CODIS. So it doesn't specify violent or nonviolent, but you might get into that violent, nonviolent aspect in your case prioritization policy, which is a separate issue.
Do solicitation requirements change each fiscal year? Or is this regular change in 23 and beyond, or is this just something specific to 23?
So the plan right now is this would continue after FY23, but this would depend on Congress if there were changes to the authorizing legislation, or if there was anything of that nature that would require us to change the program to align with something different. But right now, the appropriation is loosely for the W. Smith DNA Backlog Reduction Program. And if that legislation does not change, then there are no plans to change this portion of the CBRA program outside of what the changes are in FY 2023. That being said, if the competitive aspect does not work out well, if that doesn't meet our intended needs to really make improvements in the laboratories who are really struggling with their turnaround times and their backlogs. I mean, I know some labs are fantastic and have, backlog of 1, average turnaround time of 15 days or 5 days. But there's also laboratories who need a lot more help that maybe don't have a LIMS yet, that we really need to implement a LIMS, and that would be really critical for them. So if we don't see those impacts from that competitive aspect, then that change as well.
If you've implemented efficiencies already, do you need a policy to show these efficiencies, or are validations and procedures sufficient?
So the legislation says that you must, let me go back to the slide, have provide assurances that the state or unit of local government has implemented or will implement no later than 120 days after the date of such application a comprehensive plan for the expeditious DNA analyses of samples in accordance with the purposes of the solicitation. So, it's really up to you to decide. If you did this 10 years ago, is that sufficient? If you did that 5 years ago, is that sufficient? If you've never done that, obviously that would be a different story. So that is, again, we at DOJ can't get into approving your plan or what was appropriate, what is not appropriate. That's for your agency to decide and provide us the assurances that you have done so.
There's been a couple questions on this material. I'll go ahead and reiterate that the PowerPoint recording and transcript will be posted to the BGA website. So just keep an eye on your email. Once those items are posted, you'll be sent a direct message with a link to those. So you'll be able to go back and access this. Approximately 7 to 10 business days. Would lab technicians and analysts be eligible under contract services if they are hired, but require months of training before they're able to process casework and be eligible to use CBRA funding to pay their salary?
So the way I'm understanding this is analysts in training, if they're destined to be casework analysts, but they're being trained using CBRA funds, are they eligible to use funding to pay their salary? Yes, there's no limitations on that. They can still be funded.
Regarding the posting, it would not be limited to those who register and participated today. It'll be a public link on BGA's main website that you could forward out and access as you need to. So it is not anything you would need to register or have a password for. It's going to be publicly made available. So I'm not seeing anything else at this time, Andrea.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. Again, everybody, thank you for your attention during the webinar, and thank you for all the questions. Again, we do plan to make these changes for the FY23 CBRA solicitation, which typically posts in the spring-ish time of 2023. I will be holding at least 2 other webinars. I will be speaking at FBI's CODIS conference, and I'm available to talk about your specific questions, anything specific for your agency that you're not sure of. Want to make sure we're being fully transparent and that you guys understand the changes and how that may or may not impact your agency. So please reach out to me if I was unable to answer your specific questions during this webinar. And again, thank you for your attention.
So on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistants and our panelists, we want to thank you for joining today's webinar. This will end today's presentation.